Imagine standing in this chamber 3,000 years ago. The air is thick with incense and the low murmur of prayers. Around you, worshippers kneel with tear-streaked faces, weeping for a god who has been murdered, torn apart by his enemies, betrayed by those closest to him, his blood spilled for a cosmic drama playing out between life and death. But their mourning carries a strange undercurrent of hope, because tomorrow, everything changes. Tomorrow, they will celebrate his return. Tomorrow, their God will rise. This isn't a description of Easter. This scene predates Christianity by a long time. And yet, if you walked into certain churches on Good Friday, you'd witness something hauntingly similar. Mourning for a slain Savior, followed by jubilant proclamation of his resurrection. For 2,000 years, believers have proclaimed the death and resurrection of Jesus as a unique historical event. Something that had never happened before and would never happen again. The cornerstone of Christian faith. The miracle that proves everything. But what if it wasn't unique? What if scattered across the ancient world from the banks of the Nile to the mountains of Phrygia, people had been telling remarkably similar stories about their own dying and rising gods for thousands of years before a Jewish preacher walked the shores of Galilee? That's what we're exploring today. We're going to journey through Egyptian temples, Canaanite tablets, Greek mystery cults, and Roman festivals. We will meet gods who conquered death long before a carpenter from Nazareth allegedly did. And we will ask the question that makes many believers deeply uncomfortable. Why should we believe only one of these stories is literally true? If you're new here, welcome to MythVision. Hit that subscribe button so you don't miss our deep dives into religious history, the kind of scholarship they never taught you in Sunday school. And if you want early access to content like this before anyone else, join us on MythVision's Patreon. You'll get exclusive videos, behind-the-scenes access, and the chance to shape future episodes. Let's begin. In 1890, a Scottish anthropologist classicist named James George Frazer published a book that would shake the foundations of religious studies. The Golden Bow argued that at the heart of ancient religions lay a recurring pattern, a god who dies and rises again, embodying the cycle of nature itself. Frazer pointed to figures like Osiris, Attis, Adonis, and Dionysus, many others as well. Gods whose death and return mirrored the dying of the land in winter or drought and its rebirth in spring. But here's where it gets controversial. Frazer didn't stop at pagan gods. He suggested that Christ's resurrection was itself a late instance of this ancient mythic pattern. The implication was devastating to traditional Christian claims. Jesus wasn't unique. He was the latest iteration of a very old story. Naturally, this sparked fierce debate that continues to this day. By the late 20th century, scholars like Jonathan Z. Smith pushed back hard. Smith argued that when you examine the original sources carefully, almost none of the supposed dying, rising deities actually return to life in the way the term implies. He declared the entire category a scholarly fantasy, sloppy comparisons that ignored important differences between wildly different traditions. But not everyone was convinced by Smith's critique. Swedish scholar Tryggve Mettinger conducted what remains the most exhaustive study of the evidence, examining primary sources in their original languages. What was his conclusion? The gods I have treated did die in one manner or other and were revived after the experience of death. While each myth has unique features, Mettinger found an undeniable family resemblance among them. Even the classicist Paola Corrente sharply critiques Smith's assessments and finds him mistaken on this matter. She literally wrote her dissertation on this topic, concluding that there were many dying and rising gods, and not all were just crop examples. Think of it like the hero's journey. Not every hero follows the exact same path. Odysseus isn't Luke Skywalker, but we can still identify a recognizable pattern. The dying and rising god motif works the same way. No single myth contains every element, but together they form a coherent family of stories about divine figures who conquer death. So let's meet the family. Egypt, the banks of the life-giving Nile. Here we find perhaps the oldest dying and rising god known to history, Osiris, lord of the underworld, judge of the dead, and hope of resurrection for all who followed him. The myth is ancient beyond imagining. References appear in the pyramid text from the 3rd millennium BCE, making Osiris older than Abraham, older than Moses, older than virtually every figure in the Hebrew Bible. Osiris was a wise and beloved king who brought civilization to Egypt, teaching his people agriculture and law. But his jealous brother Set despised him. Set murdered Osiris, and in some versions of the story, dismembered his body and scattered the pieces across Egypt. His devoted wife Isis gathered his scattered remains, reassembled them, and through her magical power, brought Osiris back to life. For a brief moment, he lived again, long enough to father their son Horus, who would avenge his father and restore order to Egypt. But Osiris didn't return to rule among mortals. Instead, he descended to become the king of the underworld, the eternal lord of the dead. Now, skeptics like Jonathan Z. Smith argued that in no sense can Osiris be said to have risen, because he didn't return to physical life on Earth. But this fundamentally misses how the Egyptians themselves understood resurrection. Every year, Egyptians celebrated Osiris's death and rebirth in elaborate festivals that could last for weeks. They created corn mummies, effigies of the god made from earth and grain that would sprout and grow, symbolizing Osiris rising to new life. As the Brooklyn Museum explains, Egyptians considered grain a living divinity connected to Osiris. The fertility of the earth was proof of Osiris's continued existence. For the Egyptians, Osiris's triumph over death wasn't a metaphor. It was the foundation of their hope for the afterlife. When ordinary Egyptians died, they were literally called Osiris and then their name, identifying with the risen god to share in his eternal life. They believed that by following Osiris, by being judged worthy before him, they too could conquer death. Sound familiar? We travel now to the Bronze Age city of Ugarit in modern Syria. Here on clay tablets from around 1300 BCE, centuries before the earliest biblical texts were written, we find the dramatic saga of Baal, the Canaanite storm god, rider of the clouds, bringer of rain and life. Baal was the god of fertility, the divine force that made crops grow and herds multiply. But he faced a terrifying enemy, Mot, the god of death and drought, whose very name means death. Mot's appetite was endless, His jaws stretched from earth to heaven, and he hungered to swallow everything that lived. In the mythic texts, Mot challenges Baal, and the storm god is devoured whole, descending into the underworld, leaving the land parched and dying. The other gods, including Baal's fierce sister Anat, mourn him as dead. The great god El himself descends from his throne to sit in the dust and ash of mourning. But Anat refuses to accept defeat. She ventures into the realm of death, confronts Mot, and grinds him like grain, a powerful symbol connecting death to the harvest cycle. And then the miraculous happens. Baal returns to life and reclaims his throne. The Ugaritic text preserve the moment of his return. El receives a vision in his sleep and proclaims, "Baal lives. The prince, lord of earth, exists." At this news, the heavens rain down oil and the valley runs with honey. Life returns to the world. This myth circulated in Canaan during the exact period when the Israelites were developing their own religious traditions. The Bible itself acknowledges the power of these beliefs. Ezekiel describes women at the Jerusalem temple weeping for Tammuz, the Mesopotamian equivalent of Baal. The dying and rising god wasn't a foreign concept to the ancient Israelites. It was part of their cultural environment, all around them, impossible to ignore. In Greek mythology, no figure embodied tragic beauty quite like Adonis. This impossibly handsome youth was so beautiful that he captured the heart of Aphrodite herself. The goddess of love fell for a mortal, but his life was cut brutally short when a wild boar gored him to death during a hunt. Where his blood fell, red anemone flowers spring from the earth, beauty born from death. Every year, women throughout the ancient Mediterranean mourned Adonis's death with intense lamentation rituals. They planted gardens of Adonis, quick sprouting plants that would wither and die, symbolizing his fate. But here's where it gets truly interesting. The Greek writer Lucian describes a festival where on the third day of mourning, Adonis's image was brought out and addressed as though he were alive again. Later Christian writers Origen and Jerome explicitly describe devotees celebrating Adonis being raised from the dead on the third day. The third day! That detail should send a chill down your spine. Adonis is actually the Hellenized version of a far older deity, Tammuz, or Damuzi in Sumerian. In Mesopotamian myth, the goddess Inanna descends to the underworld and dies, then is allowed to return, but only if she sends a replacement. She chooses her lover Tammuz, condemning him to the realm of the dead. But even Tammuz doesn't stay there forever. In some versions, he spends half the year alive and half the year dead, creating an eternal cycle of death and resurrection tied to the agricultural seasons. The pattern is unmistakable. Violent death, devoted mourners, often women, and restoration to life after a brief period in death's grip. These stories predate Christianity by centuries, in some cases, by millennia. In late Roman antiquity, few celebrations matched the spectacle of the spring festival of Attis and Cybele. Attis was a Phrygian demigod, the beautiful young lover of Cybele, the great mother goddess who ruled over all nature. His myth is strange and violent. Driven mad by a jealous deity, Attis castrated himself beneath a sacred pine tree and bled to death. His body was said to have been miraculously preserved from decay, a kind of suspended animation between death and life. As the Encyclopedia Britannica summarizes, Attis in his self-mutilation, death and resurrection represents the fruits of the earth, which die in winter only to rise again in the spring. Here's what stopped early Christian observers in their tracks. The festival calendar shows March 22nd through the 25th, a day of blood involving intense mourning, fasting, and lamentation, followed immediately by the Hilaria, literally the Day of Joy, when worshippers celebrated the god's return with wild abandon. Day of mourning? Day of joy? Sound like any holiday you know? The timing is provocative. March 25th would later become the traditional date for the Annunciation in Christianity. Some early Christians celebrated Easter around the same time. Whether this is coincidence, shared cultural heritage, or direct influence remains debated by scholars. But the structural parallel is undeniable. The examples keep multiplying across the ancient world. Dionysus, the Greek god of wine and ecstasy, was said to have been killed and dismembered by Titans only to be reborn, earning him the title twice born. Ancient writers like Plutarch linked him to seasonal cycles of death and rebirth. Melkart, the chief god of Phoenician Tyre, whom the Greeks identified with Hercules, was honored with annual rituals involving a funeral pyre that signified his death and resurrection, fire consuming the god, then new life emerging from the flames. Even Zalmoxis, a mysterious Thracian figure recorded by Herodotus in the 5th century BCE, was said to have spent 3 years in an underground chamber before emerging alive, leading his followers to believe he had conquered death itself. 3 years? 3 days? The numbers vary, but the structure remains. Descent into death, period of waiting, triumphant return. These stories aren't identical. Each comes from a distinct culture with its own religious meanings and ritual contexts, but thread after thread connects them. A divine figure, a violent or tragic death, devoted mourners, often women, and ultimately resurrection, renewal, hope reborn from despair. Here's where we need to address the elephant in the room. Some scholars, and especially Christian apologists, have tried to dismiss all these parallels. Their strategy is revealing. They set an impossibly narrow definition for what counts as a dying and rising god. According to this standard, the deity must literally die and literally return to physical life on Earth in exactly the same body. By that measure, they rule out nearly every candidate. Osiris's resurrection was in the underworld, not on Earth, even though there is one mention where he may have briefly appeared on Earth. Baal's return was seasonal and cyclical. Adonis's resurrection only appears in late texts. Attis never truly rose at all, they claim. But this is a straw man standard, and scholars have called it out. As mythologist Arthur George points out, it is a cardinal mistake to insist that archetypes must appear exactly the same in each myth. We must abstract the general motif from the diverse details. Think about it. If we applied the same rigid criteria to Jesus that skeptics apply to pagan gods, we could dismiss his resurrection too. Did Jesus return to normal physical life? No, according to the Gospels, he had a transformed, glorified body that could appear and disappear at will, pass through locked doors, and eventually ascend bodily into heaven. That's not a straightforward resuscitation to ordinary life either. If resurrection must mean exactly returning to the same physical state, then Jesus doesn't qualify by his own standards. The apologist strategy ultimately becomes unfalsifiable and that should make us deeply suspicious. When parallels are early, claim they're not really resurrection. When they're later, claim Christians couldn't have borrowed from pagans. Heads I win, tails you lose. One of the most striking and controversial pieces of evidence comes from ancient Assyria. In the early 20th century, scholar Heinrich Zimmern discovered a cuneiform text that reads like stage directions for a sacred drama. The story it tells is hauntingly familiar. The god Bel Marduk, chief deity of Babylon, is captured by enemies and put on trial. He is beaten and tortured. 2 other figures are involved, one taken away to execution, another set free. The god is imprisoned in a mountain or tomb. The city falls into chaos and confusion. His clothes are stripped from his body. A goddess washes blood from a wound in his side. Then he rises from the dead and descends to the underworld to proclaim victory over death. No doubt, this is a smoking gun case, and it's generally neglected. This is an Assyrian text from about 700 BCE, and here's technically a summary outline. Bel is confined in a mountain. Someone unnamed brings Bel from the mountain. A female goes to seek Bel at his grave. Twins are appointed to guard Bel at the gate of Esagila. Bel was bound by the gods and caused to perish. The gods caused Bel to descend from the sun and light. Bel was wounded. A goddess descends into the mountain for the welfare of Bel. Bel was judged. A malefactor, criminal, was slain with Bel. After Bel went to the mountain, lower world, the inhabitants of the city where Bel was slain rioted because of Bel's death. A female goddess, Beltis of Babylon, looks for Bel, weeps for Bel, says, "O my brother, O my brother." Bel's garments were taken from him. Bel's silver, gold, and jewels were taken from him. There was a garment put upon Bel when he was put into his coffin. Bel was nursed and reared by Ishtar of Nineveh. The hymn, When on High, was recited and sung by Bel's followers during the month of Nisan when he was bound, slain. The high priest says, "These benefactions for Asur, Bel Marduk, I do," and asks, what is his sin? He, Bel, comes from within the mountain. Bel is to be resurrected. Bel was seized in the month of Nisan, after Bel was taken away from the building in which he was tried and judged. Water for hand washing was brought to the building. A goddess wails and a woman weeps for Bel. Though the original sequence of the narrated events has been scrambled, it is not difficult to discern. And when we do unscramble the lines, we find an amazingly detailed parallel to the gospel story of Jesus. Line 51 parallels the arrest of Jesus. Line 36 recalls the trial of Jesus when the high priest requests a formal declaration of the accusation of Jesus. Line 18 parallels the judgment against Jesus. Line 15 implies the flogging of the prisoner. As in line 30, Jesus' garments are seized. Line 52, you have the fetching of water for hand washing is brought to Pilate. Lines 20 and 21 note that Baal, like Jesus, was not executed alone but with another criminal. Line 14 implies the darkening of the sun when it has the gods topple Baal from the sky, since Baal was a sun god. Jesus is interred in a cave tomb, as Baal was deposited in a mountain. The twins guarding Baal, line 12, recall the pair of men, angels, posted at the empty tomb of Jesus. Lines 29 and 67 parallel the holy women weeping for the slain Jesus and visiting his tomb. As in line 32, Baal's corpse is wrapped in a burial garment. The Gospels make note of Jesus' shroud. Line 16 is reminiscent of the Gospel of Peter, where a heavenly being descends to free Jesus from his tomb. In line 38, Baal, like Jesus, emerges from his tomb. When scholars have noticed, or at least admitted having noticed, these ancient sources, their desperation is evident in their astonishing attempts to disarm the bomb. Jonathan Z. Smith claims that the text was meant merely as a parody. But a parody of what? Presumably of a very similar text, or no one would get the joke. Besides, there's nothing comical in the text, no absurd exaggeration. Here is the prime case of what we might call the irony dodge, meaning when some embarrassed by the apparent prediction in Luke 19:27 that the returned Christ will ruthlessly butcher those who rejected him, have insisted that the parable is somehow a parody. Huh? An apologist may object that this Assyrian text is too old to serve as a precedent for the gospel stories of Jesus' passion and resurrection. But the author of the Apocalypse still knew about archaic Leviathan? What's the difference? Nowhere is the untenability of the Christian apologist made more clear. Faced with such a gallery of parallels to Jesus as a dying and rising God, what reason can there be to insist that one, and only one of them, Jesus, was historically real? The will to believe can never be a legitimate bit of historical methodology. We've traveled through millennia and across continents. We've met Osiris, reassembled from death by devoted Isis, conquered the grave to offer eternal life to his followers, Baal, who descended into the jaws of death itself and emerged triumphant, Adonis and Tammuz, mourned and celebrated on the third day, Attis, whose followers moved from lamentation to wild joy, Dionysus, torn apart and twice born, Marduk, tried and tortured and risen, and then Jesus. C.S. Lewis once argued that in Jesus, the myth became fact, that all those ancient stories were dim anticipations of a single historical reality. It's a beautiful theological move, a way of acknowledging the parallels while still claiming uniqueness. But it begs the question we've been building toward this entire time. Why should we believe that only one of these stories actually happened? If the Egyptians were wrong about Osiris, if their grief and hope and devotion were just mythology, then Osiris didn't really die and rise. If the Canaanites were wrong about Baal, and the Greeks were wrong about Adonis, and the Phrygians were wrong about Attis, and the Romans were wrong about Dionysus, what makes us so certain, so absolutely certain, that the Christians alone got it right about Jesus? The dying and rising God is one of humanity's oldest and most powerful stories. It speaks to something deep in our bones, the desperate hope that death isn't the end, that love can conquer the grave, that spring will always follow winter, that the light will return after the longest darkness. Generation after generation, culture after culture, people have told this story in 1,000 different forms, dressed in the clothes of their own time and place. Perhaps the power of Jesus' story lies not in its historical uniqueness, but in its resonance with this ancient pattern. Perhaps the early Christians, like the Egyptians and Canaanites and Greeks before them, gave voice to a timeless human longing and clothed it in the details of their own world. A Jewish preacher, Roman crosses, an empty tomb in Jerusalem. That doesn't make the story less meaningful. If anything, it makes it more so. The dying and rising God belongs not to one religion alone, but to all of humanity. It's our collective dream, the dream we've been dreaming since we first looked at a dead loved one and refused to believe that was the end. The question isn't whether the pattern exists, it does. The evidence is overwhelming, documented across thousands of years and continents. The question is what we do with that knowledge. Do we cling to the claim that our version alone is literally true? That all the others were just foreshadowing? Or do we recognize that we were all telling the same story. Humanity's oldest and most persistent story. The story of life conquering death, told 1,000 different ways by 1,000 different peoples, all of them reaching for the same hope. The dying and rising gods are not dead. They never were. They live on in our traditions, our hopes, our deepest dreams of what lies beyond the grave. And when we place Jesus among them, we don't diminish him, we simply see him in contexts as the most famous member of an ancient and noble family, the latest voice in a chorus that began singing before history was written. Whether you see that as faith confirmed or faith challenged, well, I leave that up to you. But when TV fundamentalists like Franklin Graham assure viewers that he isn't dead, he's alive because God raised him from the dead, he might as well be talking about Attis, Osiris, or Baal. So won't you take a moment to say this prayer? I believe Baal is your son, and I accept him as my Lord and Savior. Thank you for watching. If this video challenged you, moved you, or made you think differently about the stories we've inherited, please like, subscribe, and share it with someone who needs to see it. These conversations matter, and you help them happen by spreading the word. The algorithm rewards engagement, and every like and comment helps this content reach someone who's been asking these questions in silence. And if you want to go deeper, if you want early access to videos like this before anyone else, plus exclusive content, live discussions with scholars, and the chance to help shape future episodes, join the MythVision family on Patreon. Your support makes this work possible. It keeps the lights on and the cameras rolling. Until next time, keep questioning, keep learning, keep seeking truth wherever it leads, and never forget, we are MythVision.